All actual life is encounter. This is a simple yet profound statement that we will explore today on the Praxology podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. On today's episode, Tyler, say hello, Tyler.
Oh, hello.
And I, Sean Smith, your co-hosts, will discuss the communal dimension of formation. What exactly are the practices that shape and form identity? I'm your host, Sean Smith, with Tyler.
Hello again.
It's great to be back.
Yes, happy 2023.
And as a reminder to all of you, our podcast is a collaboration between Formation College and Josiah Venture. But without further ado, let's talk the communal life. Tyler, all actual life is encounter. It's a quote from Martin Buber, who was a Jewish theologian. Give us your initial reaction.
Oh, it sounds very Jewish in the best possible way. As an Old Testament guy, I'm very attuned to the communal nature of life as presented in the Old Testament. That our individual actions have implications for the rest of the community, and often God deals with whole groups of people or whole families. So that seems really right to me. But even on a personal note, my PhD work is on conversation and conversation in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, and I've just been astounded at how much happens in interaction in stories. But then it's also made me more attuned to this idea of interaction and encounter in just everyday life. Like, so much of life is had in relationship, in interaction, in encounter. Things just happen when we engage in that way. I mean, yes, that's a good quote. Things just happen when we do engage in that way. But for real, it is a really fascinating thought, and I think our work overlaps there, because my PhD work is similar, actually, just dealing in the realm of pneumatology instead. But the idea of all of life is truly an encounter, and there are multiple ways we can talk about this, like what kind of encounter that we'll get into. But before we do, Buber is quite famous. Many will know, but not everybody, I'm sure, for a simple concept. It's called I-thou, and it's there's a German equivalency, but I forget what it is. But it's basically I and thou relationships, his way of conceptualizing it. He claimed that I-it is a different form of relationship, basically. So you probably get the idea already from thou and it, that those two things are different. I-it relationships only establish, like he said, like sensations, or basically experiencing an object as an it, as opposed to a thou, which introduces an element of, how do we say, like personality, something that's other than just an object. So I-thou speaks of human beings in relationship, presentness, speaks of openness, speaks of relationship. And we could say a lot more, I'm sure. If you would like to add something, go ahead. I see you're... I was curious about the German. I was curious, you mentioned the German. So for those of our listeners who maybe studied German in high school or something. Like you. Like I did, but I don't know much more than the basics. But because he was writing in German, his conception was ich und du. Yeah. In English, translated often I and thou, but it could also be translated I and you, right? Thou is kind of an Old English way of expressing that, but the thou is a much more personal way of speaking even than you. Yes. So in Czech it would be ja a ty, right? Yeah. So that's the idea behind it, the interpersonal relational connection between me and someone else.
Yeah, totally. Now Buber was he again, I said, Jewish theologian. He was really a mystic. He liked to focus in that realm. And we could say a lot more, but I think we'll just consider the idea of his statement that all life is encounter. This means that we have sort of objects and other peculiar objects as humans, basically, and things that are transcendent, which characterize our notions or our ideas of what subjects are. Now, the problem is when we encounter another person, they can become an object.
Yeah.
As Buber says, they become an object of reference. But they are truly more than that because the object has a subject. And I think the ultimate point, disagree with me if you want, Tyler, the ultimate point of all of this is relationships are transformative.
I agree with that part.
There's much more. For simplification.
Yes. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of it's hard to disagree. But like I'm trying to think if there's a good proverb, something like bad company corrupts good morals or something like that. Like we're all aware of, especially if you remember back to high school, the people you hung out with shaped who you were, who you became. And so relationships are certainly transformative. The types of people you give yourself to and allow yourself to be given to deeply shape who you become. So we want that in the best sense with God and with one another, without objectifying one another as well. So your point about people becoming kind of just a means to an end, kind of goes against this idea of relationality, of transformation in relationship.
Yeah, and I think even further back, being made in the image of God and imaging him and his character. And God is not manipulative. God is not using human beings just for the sake of they become cogs in a machine or something. And when we do that, we're actually, I think, dehumanizing in part ourselves, but also other people.
Yes.
And that's not something that's at the heart of God. So yeah, that's wonderful. And I think if we can complicate things a little bit further for a moment, there are two things that are true of the statement, all life is encounter, or as I've just rephrased it, relationships are transformative.
Mm-hmm.
One is positive, and another is quite negative. And this is, I think, true where communal dimensions of God's people in a local church tend to come into play, as we'll examine with some of the negative things of how things break down and then splits happen and some of those unfortunate things. But it's true that when we take in something from another person, even if we reject it, it still becomes a part of who we are, and that actually affects how we conduct ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually take that from R.D. Laing. He was a social psychologist in the 60s, I believe, in London, in England. And he wrote a book with the other guy. I forget his name right now. I don't remember. I think what I have written down here is not correct. I don't know if I recommend that book for everyone. It's called Interpersonal Perception. He wrote about it there and some other places. But it's quite helpful here to show that even if we perceive behavior of another person, like literally the person doesn't have to say anything out loud.
Mm-hmm.
If we just perceive their behavior as trying to communicate something, we actually adjust our own behavior according to what we think they're thinking, whether or not they're actually thinking it. So again, this is just simply true, whether they say it or not. So a lot of things can affect us, which affect our demeanor, our emotions, our behavior, and I'm sure you can take it much, much further with your analysis of conversations and in biblical text. But at least I think that gives a good starting point for thought. And particularly, this can get messy in a local church. We perceive somebody said something, but they didn't actually say it. It just gets bad. Oh. It just gets messy quickly. So communal aspects in the church can be formative, but they can also break down negatively if we don't, in effect, at least communicate well and check our assumptions and our perceptions. So we'll get back to positive aspects of formation. But this negative focus gives us some things to bring into the notion of spiritual formation, Tyler, that are not typical, I think.
No, it's not typical to consider communication as a key part of spiritual formation. But as we're saying, if spiritual formation is by nature, or should be by nature, in relational, done in community, then communication is actually a key aspect of that, of listening well, of communicating well also. And this can look different in different cultures. Some cultures are more direct in their communication, some are more indirect, but we all have ways of communicating things that there are kind of understood conventions and things, ways of communicating a posture of acceptance or positivity versus a more of a closedness. So we can certainly grow in our awareness of how we are kind of portraying ourselves in certain situations, how we're sitting, one of the key things, if you learn to even just do basic like counseling, is sitting with an open posture. So putting your hands on your knees, not being closed, not having your arms crossed. That can go a long way in kind of de-escalating conflict. But also asking clarifying questions as well. And so if there's an issue, or even just if you're trying to develop trust, you ask, well, I heard you say this. Is that what you meant? And you make sure that your perception is actually reflective of the internal reality of the person that you're talking to. And actually, we asking questions is something that God does as well, even though He knows everything. So that's one of the really interesting things about looking at some of the stories in the Old Testament, is God is a really good question asker.
Jesus as well.
And Jesus as well, absolutely. In fact, somebody was just showing me a book about this, that they actually looked at all the questions that God asks in the Bible, and kind of draw out the implications of what that means for our interaction with one another and with God. So maybe we can link that if I can remember it, in the show notes. But certainly we need to have postures of humility in that interaction, and remembering that actually, like I said at the beginning, things happen in interaction. So closing ourselves off is not an option. We need to lean in and work hard at being understood and understanding one another. Yeah,
and I'm thinking two things here. One is from again, if I can remember the texts, I'll link these from a class I took on interpersonal conflict when I was in my Master of Divinity program, and it's quite shocking how two different sides have to have a mediator or a go-between who helps facilitate discussion and hoping that it doesn't turn into arguments back and forth.
Yeah.
It could be with groups of people. It could be just two individuals who have a third party as basically a counselor. But in fancier terms, they usually call themselves conflict mediators, because there's overlap, but not always, between that and counseling. And the biggest piece is just simply helping the other people to understand. And one of the biggest timeouts you can do is okay, they said this, you took it this way. We need to see if that's what they actually mean. And when we're doing that, there's a lot to be said with the words that are there, but again, the posture is a big part of it, which is fascinating. I get I don't even know why, a picture in my mind right now of God sitting on the throne, and I wonder how we oftentimes picture him, because that could affect our own formation. We picture God up there crossing his arms like he's dissatisfied with us, versus Jesus sitting at the right hand of the Father, and him sitting there with an open listening posture, very characteristic of good counseling skills. Can we know how God sits? Systematic theologians can do this kind of thing. The ultimate answer would be, of course not. We can only infer things, but that can be a good spiritual exercise, perhaps even to just kind of wonder about how do I perceive God? Do I perceive him as open or closed? Because it seems like the communication lines in Scripture are very, very open.
Yeah.
They have ethical demands, oftentimes, but it's not just God, like, I did my part, sit back, now you do your part.
Now you do your part
you know?
and prove yourself. No, that's right. We can boldly approach the throne of grace, and we have a mediator who probably is sitting with an open posture at the right hand of the Father.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful picture, and images can be really helpful for talking about spiritual formation. What is that? There's a specific practice that's called something. What is that?
Yep, imaginative prayer.
Yeah, imaginative prayer. It's been largely influential for me whenever I have personally done that. Not super often, but several times recently through various activities connected with Josiah Ventura and whatnot. I think one maybe important piece that we can take away. I mean, we're not conflict mediators.
Nope.
But sometimes we are.
But sometimes we have to be.
And I wonder, I don't know, in my experience, Tyler, maybe you can share from yours, how conflict tends to work within a church is that it's not talked about. Mm-mm. So there's no open communication, and everything breaks down from there. And it makes me wonder if we bring in communication as an aspect of spiritual formation because God is a relational God and relationship is bound up in conversation. God unidirectionally changes us, but there's that conversation piece happening. That we bring that in, it can sort of correct and help us to then have more meaningful discussion and even disagree, but actually have some communication about it. What's your experience of that?
Well, it's hard to talk about conflict on a podcast because a lot of it is very personal, but certainly, I mean, a lot of it has to do with misunderstandings. A lot of it has to do with, assuming that we know, and even I'll speak for myself. I often assume that I know what's going on in the other person, and it's easy for me to place myself in the position of, I'm right, I have the right posture, the other person doesn't, and that makes me, kind of justifies me to say or do whatever. But in conflict, you have to kind of do both, kind of work against both of those factors of both kind of your own sense of maybe pride, its own feelings of rightness, and the possible misperceptions of the other people. So you have to actually over communicate on your end and make sure that you're being clear, but then also you have to make sure that you're seeking understanding from the other side, and that you're going the extra mile to understand. And understanding doesn't mean agreement, but from my experience in marriage coaching or marriage counseling, often you have progress. You get progress simply by understanding, even if you don't agree. The understanding piece does a lot for making progress through and out of conflict. Mm-hmm. So,
that's what that again within counseling here, the idea of an empathic statement. Mm-hmm. If you say that, people will go from having their shoulders scrunched up to, you get me, and then all of a sudden they're just talking even further and faster. It's because of just that one thing. It's like, that person truly understands what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm, and it can become very disarming. Yeah. Can we do more of that?
Yeah, seriously.
Now, I'm also reminded that in a way what we're talking about with bringing in communication as an aspect of spiritual formation, in some ways is quite obvious because relationship is how theology, our relationship with God works. We use the word relationship. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I literally just forgot what I was talking about entirely. I did have a point. But I'll just summarize and say, with communication, one of the biggest things that we can do. There it is. I found it.
Oh, you got it. Okay. Found the thread.
We're talking about the missional part, or the doing part of spiritual formation. Again, we have an assumption working that being and doing are part of it. And it's not just about formation leads to doing, in other words. So one way that we can do that is to simply listen for the heart beyond the words people are saying. I think that's a fancy way of saying be humble. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also a skill to be acquired. Mm-hmm. Like when people are using words, they're using words as symbols to communicate a deeper meaning, and that deeper meaning is in their heart, and it doesn't always come out. They're assuming a lot of things. So when people are talking, we can listen for their heart, and maybe that can be a helping start point to having effective communication, perhaps. Now, another one that I find this quite fascinating. This is in the realm of just musing. But one way we might be able to improve communication is actually to use church discipline. What do you think? What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, this is a big topic and a big question that a lot of leaders here in Central and Eastern Europe have. What role does church discipline have in a culture where power has been abused, where people are very sensitive to overreaches, manipulation in particular. Yeah, absolutely. Where communities do not always feel like safe places to belong. And yet it's so interesting looking at particularly probably Paul's letters to the early church. He placed a pretty high importance on church discipline in a restorative sense, often in that, solving problems and going after issues is how the church stays healthy. And sometimes that means setting up difficult boundaries and having hard conversations and showing, here's the path that you're on and here's where it's headed. Look at how it's affecting not only you, but all of us as well. That's what Paul seems to be doing in 1 Corinthians when they're dealing with all kinds of sexual immorality in the church. There's incest, and Paul says, you need to get them out, get this man out who's sleeping with his mother-in-law, because it's affecting the whole rest of the church. And so that's and he does so with the hope that his flesh, talks about that his flesh may be destroyed, not in the sense that he might die, but that his sinful nature would be eradicated essentially, and he'd be able to return and re-engage with the community. So there is, church discipline does play a very important role, I think, in spiritual discipline, because spiritual discipline means establishing boundaries and rhythms, and saying yes to something, saying no to other things for the sake of one's health, one's relationship with God. So of course it would make sense then that discipline would be important interpersonally in the context of a church where we're all trying to grow in our relationship with God.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we bring in this aspect of formation, communication, church discipline is because there's a lot of questions that are asked, broadly speaking, in Europe about this specific thing. And Matthew 18 talks about it explicitly, which I think maybe we can just reference here for the sake of time. It goes through a pretty strict several-step process, basically, that can be pretty easily implemented, but we're dealing with people, so it gets complex and complicated along the way. So go there, Matthew 18, verses 15 to 20. But I think to highlight before moving us forward, maybe into another text, Tyler, is to show that church discipline is to communicate values of a certain Christian God, and therefore for the purpose of developing a certain kind of character. And again, those boundaries have to be there in order to grow. I mean, if I want my son to grow in Christ likeness, I discipline him because I love him. So there are those boundaries. And I think a fun way to think about it is to reverse the breakdown of relationships in a local church from miscommunication. Church discipline is very directive and clear communication because of the ethical demands of God.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is a fascinating insight maybe into some peripheral areas of formation. But let's keep continuing on with this idea of communal dimensions of formation. Maybe bring in some Old Testament text.
Happily. Anytime. So I think we've talked in the past on this podcast about the Psalms of Ascent.
Oh, for sure we have.
Yeah. Okay. So So the Psalms of Ascent are these communal songs that Israel, the people of God, are meant to sing as they're journeying to celebrate, to feast in Jerusalem. And they deal with really ordinary kind of themes. And one of them is this kind of theme of relationships, relational harmony. And it some of these Psalms, if you read them, you're like, why is this in the Bible? Like, it feels kind of like too ordinary, but yet it's so good. Psalm 133 begins with, how wonderful, how beautiful when brothers and sisters get along.
It's a wonderful statement. Lofty thing. Nope. Just when brothers and sisters get along.
Or it was, another translation is when brothers live in unity or dwell in unity. And that's just kind of, that I think goes to some of the ordinary ways in which theology needs to be applied, that we're talking about. It's theology is not just for those in their high towers, but it should express itself in relationship. So it's a good thing and worthy of praise, not only when we accomplish great things for God or when we see Him move and do mighty things, but when brothers and sisters get along. That is marvelous and wonderful and deserving of praise, because it is somehow reflective of our God, who also desires harmony and unity in relationship. So that we see here that even this kind of a basic element, idea of relational harmony, clear communication, restoration is foundational to our being as men and women on a path with Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and it's just amazing that is in the Psalms of Ascent.
Yeah,
like they're preparing their hearts collectively and their minds collectively to enter a specific time of worshiping God with specific worship practices, like I'll just say a service, even though it's to put modern term back into, but they were saying this as they were going, and like, can you just imagine, like, hundreds of people, probably more than, and you're just watching them go by as if it's a parade, and they're just saying how wonderful, how beautiful when brothers and sisters get along. They're getting along when they're saying that statement in unity. Like, there's something that's just like blatantly obvious, but quite remarkable and beautiful, because oftentimes communications break down and anger and other things come in, and the heart of God is to dwell with His people. And as they're going up to meet with Him, they're saying how wonderful it is when we dwell in unity, because that's a reflection of who God is. And I think that's where we can bring this aspect of communication into formation quite clearly, because Psalm 133 does.
Sweet.
At the very least.
The Bible says it, so done.
Case closed.
Case closed.
Usually you could say, well, according to who? Like, this verse says this according to who? Because, but this one's pretty clear overall. Now, Eugene Peterson says, Christians make this explicit in their act of worship each week by gathering as a community. Other people are unavoidably present. So he's like, conflict is going to happen, right? You can't help it. Other people are unavoidably present. As we come together to declare our love for God, we must face the unlovely and lovely fellow sinners who God loves and commands us to love. I think he's getting at the heart of what we're talking about here. What do you think about this statement? It's
fantastic. But it to me it brings to mind the passage in 1 Corinthians again that talks about the Lord's Supper. This one of the most heightened examples of communion with one another and with God. And right in the middle of this, Paul says, you gotta deal with your stuff. Like, you gotta, like, this conflict and these issues, you gotta deal with it. if because of the importance of this reality and because of this this symbolic act of communion with God and with one another, we cannot afford to not deal with conflict and issues. So yeah, people are unavoidably present, but it's also a fantastic opportunity to grow spiritually, to grow in our relationships with one another and with God, because that's part of what communion means.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering now. Usually we're reactionary, like those people are unavoidably present, so we wait for things to happen and then we respond. I wonder what it would look like to go on the Christian offensive in a local church with this. Like if we're saying formation, communication, it's a thing, then how do we become proactive in establishing unity rather than disharmony?
Mm-hmm.
I think it could be quite simple. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? One word.
Do tell.
Encouragement.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Like that, people do talk about in spiritual practices and stuff, the gift, or maybe they refer to it more as a gift, more in the spiritual gifts, whatever, of encouragement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would maybe use a different word to kind of maybe put a different spin on it and say like a generosity of words, because what we're saying is there can be a lot of breakdown when maybe this person is thinking this and maybe I offended them, blah blah blah,
because of less words.
So generous. Maybe we could just say a generosity of words, a generous encouragement, and that's just an easy way of actually being generous. It doesn't really cost you a whole lot to go up to someone and say, I really appreciate this about you, or I saw that you did this, and this is how it blessed me or impacted me, or I'm really grateful for who you are and what God is doing in your life. That can just go a long way in breaking down barriers. So good suggestion, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, it's just amusing that's happening as we're talking along. But it is true. When you encourage somebody, they sit up in their chair.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen students do this. I've seen people who I disciple. I'll say something that's meaningful, and I do it on purpose. And if we're walking or we're sitting down having a conversation, they sit up in their chair. Or if we're walking, they'll stand up. Their shoulders will get even taller. They'll look at you with this like look of amazement on their face. But it's like, you can see they're like, wow. And it just goes such a long way. But it does require other formative aspects. I mean, the spiritual formation does have the higher calling to the character of God.
Mm-hmm.
And to be generous requires other aspects of the character of God. Like we have to be humble. We have to be looking for where God's working.
Mm-hmm.
And there are several more. Those are just the ones that are coming to my mind because they're the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
That really draws in a lot of these aspects of formation. I wonder, Tyler, in any other like final illustration, anything that might come to mind in terms of communal dimensions of worship or something like this? I mean, I've given an easy one. I think that's practical, I hope, of generous words. I'll use that. Yeah. Anything else you think of?
No, I think we're I'm
probably should land it. Yeah,
happy with what we've covered today. Yeah,
but you can let us know.
Yeah, exactly.
So please do write to us, praxology@formmission.org.uk, and let us know. We'll bring in some of those aspects. But I do think this is where we'll conclude it for today. First episode of 2023. So thank you for joining us. And in summary here, what are the practices that shape and form identity? That's kind of a question we asked at the beginning. Communication, church discipline. I think just being together as we're starting a new year, just focusing on just enjoying being together. Something I'm personally working on at the moment, because sometimes it's difficult to go to church in a different language, and it's like hard. Oh wait, this is the people of God. Like, I'm going to focus on just enjoying being there in the midst of however difficult it is. Worship, of course. And all of these things have one thing in common at the highest level, which is a community of people that consists of individual persons are transformed by doing these acts together. So there really is that communal piece. We can move into other aspects, and I think we will in due course in future episodes. If you want to hear something specific, again, write to us, praxology@formission.org.uk, and we'll be sure to engage with you. And also, do leave us a review, do leave us a comment, write to us. We really look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully in future episodes, reading some of those out, giving you a verbal shout out and a digital high five through the airwaves or something like that. But we'll see you next time on Praxology, where we will engage in issues of theology and mission for the sake of the bride of Christ prospering with generous words.
Oh.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.